The in-laws laughed when they left a $10 cabin in the inheritance, without discovering what it hid. Maya never imagined that the day she received an inheritance would be the day she felt the most second-hand embarrassment in her own skin. Sitting among people who had never accepted her, she heard the lawyer announce out loud what her father-in-law had left for her, and the sound of the laughter that followed would still echo in her head for many weeks. The cabin was worth $10. That's what the official appraisal said, which the lawyer read in a slow voice, as if he needed time for each word to land in the air with as much weight as possible. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling, her mother-in-law, raised an eyebrow with a smile that barely tried to hide itself. Brooke, her sister-in-law, covered her mouth with her hand, but her shoulders were shaking. Grant, her brother-in-law, didn't even bother to be discreet. $10, he repeated loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. I think there's more termite than brick in that ruin. Maya said nothing. She carefully folded the document, put it in her purse, and stood up. She walked to the door without rushing, without looking sideways, without giving any of them the satisfaction of seeing that anything had come close to hurting her. Caleb, her husband, ran after her in the hallway. Maya, wait. I didn't know it would be like this. She stopped. She looked at him for a second, and then kept walking. I know you didn't know, Caleb, she said, without anger, just with the weariness of someone who has carried too much weight for too long. But they knew. The drive back home was silent. Caleb drove with his eyes fixed on the road, and Maya stared out the window at the open fields that stretched along the state highway, cutting through the countryside. It was a small town, nestled between hills covered with low vegetation and old trees, where everyone knew everyone and secrets lasted until the following Tuesday. Ever since she had arrived in that town as a daughter-in-law of the Sterlings, she had learned that every word spoken out loud carried twice the weight of those left unspoken. That night, while Caleb slept, she took the appraisal out of her purse and placed it on the kitchen table. The dim light of the lamp yellowed the paper. She read it carefully, not for the first time, but with different eyes. There was something in the text that didn't add up. The physical description of the property mentioned a land area that seemed too large for a simple abandoned cabin. There were technical terms about boundaries and limits that she didn't fully understand, but there was a number, a square footage, that seemed disproportionate to what the appraisal classified as the main structure. She wrote everything down in a notebook and went to bed. But she didn't sleep. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Over the following days, Maya went to the county clerk's office twice. The first time she asked about records of rural properties in the west end of the county. The clerk, a man with thin glasses and a gloomy expression, said she needed a specific registration number. She didn't have one. She went back the second time with the appraisal document and asked for guidance. The same clerk, with the same vague tone, said that documentation was subject to review and that there were forms that would need to be updated. When she asked which forms and how to fill them out, he said he couldn't give legal advice and asked her to seek a lawyer. She left the county clerk's office with the feeling that a door had been deliberately closed in her face, but she still didn't know why. On the weekend, she waited for Caleb to leave to visit his mother, which happened every week without fail, like an unwritten obligation he had never questioned, and she took the car. She turned onto the dirt road that led to the property, passing an old fence with a wooden gate that creaked when opened. The path was narrow and covered with loose stones. The vegetation on both sides had grown wild, and branches scraped the sides of the car. The cabin stood at the far end of a lot flanked by old trees with twisted trunks, casting an uneven shadow over the dry, rocky ground. The structure was made of stone, not brick, as Grant had said mockingly, but real stone, that ancient stone that seemed to have been placed there by the very force of time. The walls were covered in climbing vegetation with small, dark leaves. The windows had no glass, and the afternoon breeze flowed in and out with a soft sound, almost like breathing. Maya got out of the car with the notebook under her arm. She stood still for a moment, looking at the building with the paper in her hand, the folded appraisal she had taken from her bag for the 100th time. The stone facade was more beautiful than she had expected. There was a dignity there, even under all that layer of neglect. She entered slowly. The floor was of split stone, some pieces shifted by time, others still firmly in place. The smell was of damp earth mixed with old plaster and something she couldn't identify, a kind of mineral warmth that came from the walls. Light entered through the windows in wide golden bands that cut through the interior darkness. She walked through the main room, then went down the narrow hallway that led to the back. There were two smaller rooms at the back, one with a partially collapsed ceiling, revealing the blue sky above. She stopped in the center of the intact room and looked at the floor. That's when she saw it. In the corner, near the wall, there was a stone slightly different from the others. Not in color, not in size, but in position. It was a millimeter out of alignment, as if someone had moved it and put it back without being able to get it exactly as before. Maya knelt on the floor and ran her fingers along the edge of the stone. It moved. With both hands, she carefully shifted it. Underneath was a shallow cavity dug in the earth, and inside it, a rusty tin box with a dented lid. She had to use force to open it. Inside, wrapped in a cotton cloth that had yellowed with age, was a bundle of folded papers, held together with a rubber band that crumbled at her touch, too dried out to withstand handling. She opened the papers with hands that couldn't stay completely still. They were handwritten contracts with firm, slanted handwriting. There were measurements done in ink that had faded to a sepia tone. And there was a map drawn with care and attention, with boundary markings made with a ruler, names of geographical references noted in the margins, and a line that delineated an area of land that was much, much larger than the official appraisal had described. Maya remained kneeling on the cold stone floor for a time. She couldn't tell how long. She looked at the papers, she looked at the map. She went back to the papers. Outside, the wind moved the old trees with that dull, continuous sound she had already begun to associate with that place. She carefully stored everything inside the notebook, put the notebook in her bag, and stood up. She looked at the displaced stone, put it back in place as she had found it. She walked to the car with a steady step. And as she drove back to town, with the afternoon sun falling on the dirt road and dust rising behind the wheels, she thought about her father-in-law, who had never bothered to explain anything, but who had kept those papers there for some reason she still didn't fully understand. Mr. Samuel Sterling had been a man of few words, tall with greying hair and a slow way of walking that didn't match the agility he still showed when he wanted to. Maya had lived with him for 4 years, long enough to learn that he observed far more than he spoke, and that when he said something, it was worth listening to. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling dominated family conversations. Brooke and Grant orbited around their mother, and Mr. Samuel Sterling sat in the corner, coffee in hand, and saw everything. Once at a Sunday family dinner that had soured because of a comment from Mrs. Eleanor about the food Maya had brought, he had gotten up from the table, walked to the kitchen, and stood next to his daughter-in-law as she arranged the silverware to avoid looking at anyone. "You have the patience of a saint, Maya," he said in a low voice. She hadn't replied, but she had held on to that. Now, as she drove back with the papers in her bag, she wondered if he had known, if he had planned it, if that $10 shack was a joke or a promise. She didn't sleep that night either. The next morning, before Caleb woke up, she called City Hall and asked for the contact information of licensed surveyors working in the area. The attendant gave her 2 names. She wrote both down and called the first one right away. The name was Otis Caldwell, and he worked in a neighboring town 40 minutes away. "Mr. Caldwell, I need an appraisal of a rural property," she said. "I have historical documentation that might help, and I need this done discreetly." There was a brief pause on the other end. "I can come to the site on Thursday. Send me the address." She sent it, and she didn't say anything to Caleb. The wait for the days between that call and Thursday was long. Maya kept up her routine. She worked from home as an administrative assistant for a small accounting firm, did the grocery shopping, cooked, washed, tidied up. Caleb came home from work, ate, watched TV, and slept. They talked about small things, about bills, about the weather, about the neighbor who had replaced his gate, and underneath all that, there was a silence that had grown since the day of the will reading, like a plant no one had planted, but that was there, growing slowly between them. Whose side had he been on? She still couldn't answer that with certainty. He had run after her in the hallway, yes, but he hadn't said a word inside the room when the laughter rang out. He hadn't put his hand on his mother's shoulder and said, "That's not funny." He hadn't looked at his brother and said, "Enough." He had sat there with that expression of wanting to disappear. Maya knew that expression. She had learned to recognize it in the first months of marriage, when she still thought it was shyness, that it was just his way, that he would change over time. 4 years later, she knew it wasn't shyness. It was a choice he made every day without realizing he was making it. On Thursday, she went to the property alone and arrived before Otis. She stood in front of the shack with the notebook in her hand, looking at the stone walls and the old trees around, with the blue sky above and the clouds slowly passing by. There was something about that place that she couldn't name, a kind of silent weight, as if those walls had held many things for a long time and were waiting for someone to finally come and look. Otis arrived at 10 in the morning in an old white pickup truck, got out with a tool case and a measuring device slung over his shoulder. He was a man around 55, thin, with sun-worn skin and a direct way of speaking that Maya found comforting. She showed him the papers. He examined them carefully, saying nothing for a long time. Then he picked up his tools and started working. He spent over 3 hours on the property, walking, measuring, taking notes, cross-referencing the markings on the old map with the data from his equipment. Maya sat on a large rock near the old fence, the sun warming her back, and waited. When he came back to her, his face wore an expression she couldn't quite read. "This documentation here," he said, holding the old map carefully, "was done by someone who knew what they were doing. The geographic references match the current ones. I cross-referenced them with the county clerk's records I have access to." "And?" she said. Otis took a deep breath. "The actual area of this land is 43 times larger than what's stated in the report you showed me. This property stretches across that strip of land over there." He pointed beyond the ancient trees, toward a gentle valley she had seen but hadn't connected to the property. "All the way to that point near the creek. That's fertile land, Maya. Good land, and it has historical record." She was quiet for a moment. "How is that possible? How did nobody notice?" "Because nobody looked," he said simply. "The original record was made decades ago, probably when the property was larger and part of a tract that was confusingly subdivided over the years. The report you have was based on a quick visit to the cabin structure, without any field measurement. It's the kind of thing that happens when no one has an interest in being thorough." Maya looked at the land, at the ancient trees with their twisted trunks and wide canopies, at the valley beyond them, at the stone cabin, hit from the side by the afternoon sun, making the old stones glow a warm golden color. "I need a signed technical report," she said. "You'll have it," Otis replied. She went home with a different feeling in her chest. It wasn't joy. It was something heavier and more serious than joy. It was the feeling of someone who has found a path where there seemed to be none, but who knows the path will be hard to travel. That night, as she set the table for dinner, Caleb's phone rang. She didn't pay attention. He always got calls from his mother around that time. But this time the conversation was longer, and when he hung up and came into the kitchen, there was something different in his expression, a discomfort she recognized immediately. "My mom called," he said. "I know," she replied, without turning from the sink. "She wants to know if you went to the property this week." Maya stopped. She slowly put down the plate she was holding on the counter, turned around. "Why does she want to know that?" Caleb looked away for a second. "I don't know. She said someone saw a car parked near the gate on Thursday. So someone had been watching. She hadn't thought of that, but it made sense. The gate was near a road some people used as a shortcut into town. Anyone passing by could have seen it. Are you going to tell me what you were doing there?" he asked. She looked at her husband for a moment, at the face she had loved easily in the early days, and that now she saw with that mixture of affection and weariness that frightened her when she stopped to acknowledge it. "I went to see what was left to me," she said. "It's my right." "Maya." "It's my right, Caleb." He was quiet. Then he sat down on the kitchen chair with that expression of someone who doesn't know where to go. She finished setting the table and placed the plates without saying another word. 2 days later, Mrs. Eleanor Sterling showed up unannounced. It was a Tuesday morning, and Maya was home working when she heard the doorbell. She opened the door, and there was her mother-in-law, elegant as always, purse on her arm, and a smile that looked like it had been painted with a fine brush over a completely different expression. "Good morning, Maya. May I come in?" She was well dressed, as always, not in an ostentatious way, but with that care of someone who knows exactly what every detail communicates. Grey hair, neatly styled, good quality clothes in neutral tones, discreet earrings. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling was 71 years old and carried her age with a stiffness that sometimes looked like elegance and sometimes like armor. "Of course," Maya said, stepping aside to let her in. Her mother-in-law walked into the living room and stood there, looking around as if making an assessment she hadn't been asked to make. "Would you like some coffee?" Maya offered. "No, thank you. I came to talk." Maya sat on the couch. Mrs. Eleanor stood for a moment, then sat in the armchair next to her, folded her hands in her lap and looked at her daughter-in-law. "Maya, I know what happened at the reading of the will was uncomfortable," she began. "Uncomfortable," Maya repeated, neutral. Samuel always had ways of doing things the rest of the family didn't fully understand. He had his own way of, how shall I put it, arranging things. "What do you want, Mrs. Eleanor?" Her mother-in-law blinked once. She wasn't used to being interrupted. "I only want to know if you found anything interesting on that property," she said, in a tone that tried to be casual but didn't come close. Maya looked at her, studied her face, her eyes, the way she held her hands with just a bit more pressure than was relaxed. "Just an old ruin," Maya said, like Grant said, more stone than brick. Mrs. Eleanor stared at her for a second longer than necessary. Then she smiled, that thin-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good," she said, "because it really has no value at all. It would be a shame for you to waste time on something that won't lead anywhere." "You're right," Maya said. "Thank you for coming." Her mother-in-law left with the same calculated elegance with which she had arrived. Maya stood at the window and watched her get into the car, drive around the block and disappear at the corner. Then she went to the bedroom, opened the closet, took out the shoebox that was in the back, and checked to see if the copies she had made of all the documents were still there. They were. She had learned early on that keeping things at home was risky when someone had a key to your door. Caleb wouldn't give the key to his mother, she knew that. But she had also learned that caution cost nothing. That afternoon, she took a second set of copies to her Aunt Mildred's house, who lived 12 kilometers away and had been the closest person to Maya since childhood. Aunt Mildred was 68, a widow, and had the kind of practical, quiet intelligence of someone who had lived a lot and learned even more. She listened without interrupting once, her coffee growing cold in the cup in front of her. When Maya finished, her aunt was silent for a moment. "That man left you that on purpose," she said finally. "I think so too," Maya said. "But you still don't know why." "Not completely." Mildred looked out the window at the yard full of pots. "You'll find out, but before you find out you're going to suffer quite a bit," she said, without cruelty, with the simple honesty of someone who had no time for illusions. "They won't let it come cheap." "I know," Maya said. "And Caleb?" Maya took a moment to answer. "I still don't know where he is, Aunt." Mildred nodded slowly, as if that were the answer she expected. "Keep those papers here," she said, "and don't tell anyone else." Otis Caldwell's report arrived by email the following week. It was an 8-page technical document with blueprints, measurements, comparisons, and a conclusion he had written with the dry objectivity of someone who works with data, but which Maya read 3 times with her heart racing. The actual property, based on historical documents cross-referenced with a recent field survey, showed a total area corresponding to 43.2 hectares, spread across a strip of land that included low-lying fertile ground bordering a seasonal watercourse, an area of native forest in regeneration, and soil suitable for cultivation. The official appraisal submitted in the probate had only considered the built structure and a land measurement corresponding to the immediate surroundings, disregarding the historical boundaries recorded in the original county clerk documents. She printed the report, placed it with copies of the old documents, and drove to the neighboring town where there was a small law office she had found through a co-worker's recommendation. The lawyer's name was Arthur Miller, about 45 years old, with round glasses and the attentive manner of someone used to hearing complicated stories without losing track of the details. He read everything. He asked precise questions, took notes, asked for copies of everything. "This case has merit," he said at the end. "The historical documents are valid. The appraisal submitted in the probate was clearly done without a proper survey. There is a basis to challenge the valuation and start a regularization process based on the actual measurement." "And what could happen?" she asked. "The family will contest it. They'll likely hire someone to do a second appraisal, trying to invalidate these documents, and the process could be lengthy." "How long?" "Months. Maybe a year, depending on how the other side reacts." Maya took a breath. "What's the cost?" He placed his pen on the desk. "I'm going to be honest with you. Right now, given what you've shown me and the nature of the case, I'm willing to work on a contingency fee basis. If you win, I get a set percentage. If you lose, you owe nothing." She stared at him. "Why?" He closed the folder slowly. "Because this type of case, when the documentation is as solid as this appears to be, rarely goes well for the side that's in the wrong, and I prefer to be on the right side." Maya shook his hand and left the office with a lightness she hadn't felt in a long time. But she knew this was the beginning, not the end. When she got home that afternoon, Caleb was sitting in the living room with a stony face. The way he looked at her when she walked in, she knew he knew something. "My mum called me," he said. "Again," she replied, setting her bag on the chair. "She said you hired a surveyor and that you're trying to change the probate outcome." Maya stood still. "How does she know that?" "I don't know. She didn't say how she knows. She just said you're stirring up trouble where it's not needed." "Caleb," she said, in a calm voice that took effort to maintain, "what they left me in the probate could be worth much more than anyone imagined. I have documentation to prove it. I have the right to pursue what's mine." "But you didn't tell me anything." He raised his voice, and she saw that it had genuinely hurt him. "I didn't tell you because the last time I needed you, you said you were going to talk to your mother before making any decision," she said, without raising her tone. "And I learned from that." He was quiet. There was something in his face at that moment that she couldn't quite define. Anger, shame, or both. "You should have told me, Maya. And you should have stood by me when they laughed at me in front of everyone," she replied. Silence. "I didn't know what to do," he said more quietly. "I know. But I needed you and you weren't there." She grabbed her purse back. "I'm going to take a shower." And she left the room. That night, they slept in the same room, in the same heavy silence as before, but with a difference. For the first time in 4 years, she felt she had said what she needed to say. And it hurt and relieved at the same time. 2 days later, Mrs. Eleanor Sterling acted. The lawyer Arthur called Maya early in the morning. "The opposing family has filed a motion to halt the regularization process," he said. "Their argument is that the documents found on the property are too old to have current legal validity, and that the official report registered at the county clerk's office should prevail. And will that stop the process?" "Temporarily, while the motion is reviewed, but don't worry, I expected this." She hung up and sat at the kitchen table with her coffee cooling in the cup. She had expected it too, but expecting didn't make it any easier to swallow. That same week, Brooke started talking. Maya found out from a neighbor that Brooke had told a mutual group of friends that her sister-in-law was trying to steal the family inheritance, that she had found old worthless papers and was using them to stir up trouble, that Mr. Samuel Sterling would never have intended to leave anything important to someone who wasn't even really family. The phrase that reached her most was the last one, someone who wasn't even really family. 4 years of Sunday family dinners, 4 years of Christmas and Easter in that house, 4 years of comments about her clothes, her cooking, her way of speaking, the family she came from, everything she was or wasn't by their standards, and she wasn't even really family. Maya was quiet for days after that, not out of sadness, or not just sadness. It was a kind of cold anger that she wouldn't let heat up, because she knew hot anger misses the mark, and she couldn't afford to miss. It was during this time that Grant showed up. Not at home. Grant had never set foot in her house, nor had she expected him to. But she ran into him by chance one afternoon in the grocery store line. He had 2 items in his cart, a wide-brimmed hat, and that way of walking with his broad shoulders he had, as if he were always arriving somewhere that belonged to him. When he saw her, he didn't look away. "Maya," he said, stepping closer, "I need to be direct with you." "Be direct," she said. "You're creating a problem that doesn't need to exist. Those old papers mean nothing. The county clerk's office won't accept a regularization based on a survey by a topographer you paid for. This is going to cost money you don't have, time you'll waste, and stress that will hurt your marriage to my brother." "Thanks for your concern, Grant," she said. "It's not concern," he replied more dryly. "It's a warning." "I heard you," she said, and she turned to the cashier. She left the grocery store with the bags in her hands and got into the car. She sat for a moment before starting the engine. She wasn't scared. She had that feeling of someone receiving a confirmation they already expected. There was something on that property they wanted to keep hidden, and they knew what it was. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. That night she opened the notebook and began to write down everything she knew, everything she had discovered, and everything she still didn't understand. There were questions that remained unanswered. Why had Mr. Samuel Sterling hidden those documents under a rock instead of keeping them at home? Why had he left the property specifically to her, knowing the family would laugh? What was in that cabin that made the place so important to him? Important enough to plan years in advance where to hide a message that only someone who truly looked would find. And there was another question, smaller but persistent. How had Mrs. Eleanor found out so quickly that there was a surveyor on the property? That dirt road wasn't very busy. Someone had tipped her off. Someone was watching her closely. The answer came from where she least expected it. It was a Saturday morning when an elderly woman knocked on the door. Maya opened it and saw an older woman, around 70-something, her face lined with expression marks that made her look like someone who had smiled and cried a lot over a well-lived life. White hair pulled back in a simple bun, a floral button-down dress, a cloth bag over her arm. "Are you Maya, Samuel's daughter-in-law?" "I am," said Maya, surprised. "My name is Hazel Higgins. I was a neighbor of the Sterling family for over 40 years. I lived on the property next door until about 2 years ago, when my son brought me into town. May I come in?" Maya opened the door. They sat in the living room with coffee. Mrs. Hazel put the bag on her lap and looked at Maya with those sharp little eyes of someone who had seen a lot. "I heard you went to the cabin," she said. "You know, in that part of the county, everyone knows everything," she said without ceremony. "But I didn't come for gossip. I came because I think it's time someone told you certain things." Maya held the cup with both hands. Mrs. Hazel began. She had known Mr. Samuel since they were both young. He had arrived in that rural area with Eleanor when they were newlyweds, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a will to build. They had lived in the stone cabin for almost 6 years before Mr. Samuel's business began to take off. That place had been their first home, where they had gone hungry during the tough months, where they had warmed themselves by a fire in the winter, where they had raised their first child before they could afford to buy a house in town. "When he got rich," said Mrs. Hazel with the precision of someone choosing her words carefully, "Eleanor didn't want to hear about that place anymore. She was ashamed of where they had started. She pressured him to sell, but he never sold. They fought a lot about it." "And he kept the cabin," said Maya. "He kept the cabin, and all the land around it, which was much bigger than most people knew. Eleanor didn't like the subject, so the subject was never brought up. But Samuel never forgot what that place meant." Maya looked out the window. "Do you know why he left it to me?" Mrs. Hazel set the cup on the coffee table gently. "He told me about you about 2 years ago, when he was still healthy. He said you were the only one in the family who listened when he talked, that the others were always too busy with what they were going to receive to pay attention to what he was saying. She paused. He said he was leaving the cabin to you because you were the only one with eyes to see what others didn't want to see. Maya felt something tighten in her chest. He knew I would find the papers. He knew that if anyone was going to look, it would be you. Mrs. Hazel looked at her with those sharp eyes. But there's one thing he told me that maybe you don't know yet. What? The woman took a deep breath. The documents you found under the stone, she said. They're not the only ones. He told me there was another box, not in the cabin, in the wall of the hallway inside, behind the plaster, near an inscription he had carved into the stone with the knife he used when he lived there. He said he put something there a long time ago, and that one day someone would find it. Maya stood so still that Hazel herself asked if she was all right. I am, she said. I need to go back to the cabin. I know, said Mrs. Hazel Higgins, and she took a cloth-wrapped bundle out of her bag. He gave me this to keep. Said it was to be given to the right person at the right time. I think you're the person and the time is now. Inside the bundle was a small, rusty key and a folded piece of paper with handwriting that Maya recognized immediately, the same steady slant as the contracts she had found under the stone. She unfolded the paper with hands that this time truly trembled. The message was short. There was no heading, no date, no signature, just one line. Those who seek will find. Those who find will understand. And those who understand will know what to do. Maya folded the paper back. She looked at Mrs. Hazel Higgins. Did you know what was inside this bundle? No. He only told me that when the time came I would know who to give it to. Maya gripped the key tightly. It was small, made of darkened metal, the kind of key that opens old boxes or chests or padlocks that have seen decades of use. Thank you very much, Mrs. Hazel Higgins, she said. The woman stood up, grabbed her empty bag, and walked to the door. Before leaving, she turned. Mr. Samuel was a good man, she said. He just didn't have enough courage to say things out loud when Mrs. Eleanor was around. But he kept what he needed to keep, and he left it where it needed to be left. She opened the door. Take care of yourself. She left. Maya stayed in the living room with the key in her hand for a long time. Then she went to get the car. That afternoon the cabin had a different light. The sun was lower, and the old trees around it cast long, uneven shadows over the rocky ground. The wooden gate creaked as it opened, as always. The path was drier than last time. She walked slowly through the interior, following the route she already knew by heart. She passed through the main room, down the narrow hallway, and stopped in front of the wall on the right side, near the fork that led to the two smaller rooms. There, almost invisible beneath a layer of aged plaster that had lightened over time, was an inscription. She had to run her hand along the wall and look closely, tilting her head so that the sidelight from the window without glass illuminated the relief. There were two names, Eleanor and Samuel, and a date, a year that fell more than 40 years ago. She stood in front of that inscription for a while. She thought of young Eleanor, before the pride and the rigidity and the sharp remarks. She thought of young Samuel, carving those letters with a knife into the stone of a house that was all they had. She thought of how much time had passed between that moment and the day when the same Eleanor had laughed out loud at an heiress receiving $10. Then she looked at the plaster next to the inscription and began to search. It took nearly 20 minutes. The plaster was hard, and the stone wall underneath did not give easily, but there was a spot just below and to the right of the inscription where the plaster sounded slightly different when she tapped it with her knuckles, a hollower, deeper sound. She worked carefully, using a larger key from her keychain as an improvised tool, chipping away the plaster little by little. Beneath it was a small opening, closed off by a wooden plank that had darkened with years of moisture. She used her fingers to pry the plank out. Inside, embedded in the stone at the back, was another box. This time, not tin, but wood, small, with a tiny lock that matched the rusty key Mrs. Hazel Higgins had given her. She crouched there, holding the box in her hands in the silence of that room where the wind came in through the window without glass, with that breathing sound she had already learned to recognize. She put the key into the lock. The lid opened. Inside was a document. Not old contracts this time, not maps and measurements. It was a single folded paper, more recent than the others, dated about 3 years ago, just before Mr. Samuel started having health problems. The handwriting was the same, but more hesitant, as if the hand that had written it no longer obeyed with the same steadiness as before. She read it. The document was a handwritten statement, notarized at the county clerk's office. She saw the stamp and the notary's signature in the lower corner, in which Mr. Samuel Sterling stated, without ambiguity, that the property registered as Oldstone Estate had been deliberately undervalued in a later assessment for reasons he did not specify, and that the actual square footage had been established in the original founding documents of the property, which he had preserved in a safe place. The statement further affirmed that the property had been left to his daughter-in-law, Maya Van Sterling, with full knowledge of its real value, and that any attempt to contest that designation would not have had the grantor's consent in life, nor should it receive the law's consent after his passing. There was a final line, written apart from the others, with a larger space. Maya knows how to listen, she always has. I trust she will know what to do with what she finds. She sat on the cold stone floor for a long time, that paper in her hand, the sun coming in through the window without glass and falling in golden streaks around her. She didn't cry right away. She was quiet first, letting those words settle in. Then she cried. Not from victory, not from sadness. It was a crying she couldn't quite name, a mix of recognition, of exhaustion, of gratitude for a man who had chosen to trust her in a way no one else had, and of pain for everything that had happened between that silent trust and that moment on the cabin floor. When she finished, she wiped her face with the back of her hand, carefully folded the document, placed it inside her bag along with everything else, and stood up. She called Arthur Miller while she was still on the property. "Arthur, I need you to look at a new document," she said. "I think it changes the situation completely." 2 mornings later, she was in his office with the document in hand. Arthur read it silently, then read it again. Then he placed the paper on the desk and stared at it for a moment. Was this document notarized when it was made? "It has a stamp and a signature. It's verifiable." "Then this changes what I think about the resolution time," he said. "With this, plus Otis's report and the original documents, the basis of the case becomes much stronger, and the argument that the assessment was deliberately incorrect is supported by the original owner himself. Can they still contest it? They can. They always can. But the ground has shifted." He smiled slightly. Figuratively speaking. She left the office and called Aunt Mildred. "Aunt," she said when the old woman answered, "you were right. Samuel left everything ready." On the other end, there was a silence, and then the aunt's raspy, affectionate voice. "I knew that man wasn't a fool, and neither are you." The case entered a new phase, and Mrs. Eleanor Sterling responded the way Maya had expected her to, with full force. Her mother-in-law hired a second lawyer, more experienced according to what reached Maya's ears through the indirect channels she had learned to use, and managed to commission a new technical report that tried to reclassify the land as unproductive, arguing that the vegetation was native and not suitable for cultivation, and that the watercourse mentioned was too seasonal to be considered a significant water resource. The report also questioned the validity of the historical documents, suggesting that the markings on the old map could not be verified with enough precision to support a regularization based on them. It was a calculated move, and there was enough technical quality in her to cause real problems. Arthur reviewed the report carefully. "They have a good professional," he admitted, "but there are 2 weak points here. First, they didn't have access to the notarized affidavit you found. Not yet. I'd rather present that at the right moment, not now. Second, the argument about the watercourse can easily be contested with field measurements in different seasons. I'll ask Otis to redo part of the survey focusing on that point." "How long will that take?" 3-4 weeks for the technical documentation, then the hearing." He looked at her. "Are you prepared for a hearing?" "I am," she said. And she was. But prepared didn't mean without fear. It meant being scared and going anyway, which was different. In those weeks, the situation at home was getting harder. Caleb had found out through his mother that the lawsuit was more serious than he had imagined. One night, when Maya came into the bedroom after another long session, reading documents at the kitchen table, he was awake and sitting on the edge of the bed. "Maya, I need you to tell me everything," he said. "Really, from the beginning." She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she came in, sat on the other side of the bed and told him everything, from the displaced stone to Otis, to Mrs. Hazel Higgins's visit, to the key to the wooden box, to the notarized affidavit. As she spoke, she watched his face. She saw the emotions passing through it in sequence: surprise, disbelief, something that looked like shame, and finally an expression she had seen a few times but recognized as his face when he was processing something that changed how he understood a situation. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. "My father knew everything," he said, more to himself than to her. "He planned it," she said, carefully. "Why didn't he tell me?" She looked at him. "Caleb." "No, you can say it. I think he knew you'd go to your mother first." Silence. He didn't deny it, and the fact that he didn't deny it said more than any answer he could have given. "What do you need from me?" he asked after a moment. She looked at her husband with that mix of affection and weariness she had learned to live with. "I need you to decide where you stand," she said. "Not for me, for you." He didn't answer that night, but she noticed he stayed awake long after she had fallen asleep. Grant showed up once more, this time not by chance. He called Caleb's cell phone on a Saturday afternoon and asked the two of them to go to his mother's house. Maya knew because Caleb told her right after hanging up, his face tense. "I'll go," he said. "But I wanted to tell you first." "Go," she said. "And listen to what they actually say." Caleb came back 3 hours later. He stood in the middle of the living room for a second, like someone still digesting something, and then sat down. "Grant proposed a settlement," he said. "My mother drops her challenge to the lawsuit. In exchange, you give up half of the regularized land to the estate, which is divided among the 3 children. Maya looked at him. "And what did you say?" "I said I'd talk to you." "And what do you think?" He took a deep breath. "I think my father left it to you, not to be split up." It was the first time he had said that. She felt the weight of those words and was quiet for a moment, letting it exist without rushing. "I'll talk to Arthur," she finally said. Arthur heard the proposal and shook his head. "They're proposing this because they know their position is weakening. Half of a regularized piece of land is still a lot. But the proposal has a fundamental problem. It assumes the land wasn't legitimately left to you. And accepting would mean acknowledging there's something to divide, when in reality there isn't. Then I won't accept. I wouldn't accept it either, but know that rejecting it will stir things up before the hearing." "I know," she said. And it did. Brooke went to the hair salon where Maya's best friend, Cassie, worked as a manicurist and passed on a distorted version of the story that included vague but venomous accusations about Maya's intentions. Cassie called Maya as soon as Brooke left, outraged, telling her everything she'd heard. Maya thanked her, noted what had been said, and let it go. Grant pressured Caleb by phone 3 times in 1 week, alternating between appeals to family loyalty and vague threats of consequences that never became concrete enough to be taken seriously. Caleb listened, hung up, and told Maya. She took notes. And then, 10 days before the hearing, something happened that she hadn't foreseen. Caleb went to his mother's house alone without telling Maya. She found out when he didn't show up at his usual time and later called to explain where he was. She said she was fine and hung up. She sat in the kitchen waiting. He came back 2 hours later with red eyes. She had never seen him like that before. He sat down in the kitchen without taking off his jacket. "I talked to her," he said. "I know. I really talked, Maya. Not the way I always did, letting her speak and nodding along. I said what I think." She was quiet, waiting. I told her my father had the right to leave things to whoever he wanted. I told her what happened at the reading of the will was wrong, and that I should have said so then. I told her, I chose you. His voice got quieter. And I told her that if she didn't respect that choice, she would be the one pulling away, not me. Maya looked at him for a long moment. And her? She asked. She was quiet. Then she cried. He rubbed his face with his hands. I've never seen my mother cry like that. Maya said nothing. There was a part of her that wanted to ask what her mother-in-law's tears meant. Remorse, manipulation, or simply the surprise of a woman being confronted by her son for the first time in many years. But she didn't ask. Some things needed time to show what they really were. Thank you, she said simply. He looked at her. You don't have to thank me. Yes, I do, because it cost you. And you did it anyway. He reached his hand across the table. She placed hers over it. They stayed like that for a moment in the silence of the kitchen, with the lamplight casting a yellow glow around them. The conciliation hearing took place on a Thursday morning in a small room at the county clerk's office in the neighboring town. There were 2 tables, wooden chairs, a window with blinds, and the faint smell of old paper that Maya had associated with county clerk's offices ever since she'd first stepped into one as a child. On the other side of the table sat Mrs. Eleanor Sterling's lawyer, a man in a grey suit with slicked back hair. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling sat beside him, with her usual upright posture and an expression that Maya tried to read but couldn't quite decipher. Grant sat further back, arms crossed. Brooke had not shown up. On this side sat Arthur, and next to Arthur sat Otis, with his briefcase of documents and measuring equipment leaning against the wall. Caleb sat next to Maya in a suit, his hands on the table. The mediator was a man around 60, with a lined face and the calm demeanor of someone who had sat through many disputes and learned that rushing served neither side. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling's lawyer began. He presented the recent appraisal, questioned the validity of the historical documents, argued that the undervaluation had been the result of a legitimate assessment conducted by a qualified professional at the time of the inventory. Arthur responded calmly. He presented Otis's report, and Otis was called to explain the methodology in detail. Then she presented the historical documents, along with the technical analysis she had requested from a specialist in historical cartography. And then she presented the declaration. The silence that followed was different from the other silences in the room. Mrs. Sterling's lawyer read the document, read it again, asked the mediator to verify the stamp. The mediator checked. The declaration was valid. It was recent enough not to have been affected by any statute of limitations issues, and it was clear enough that there was no ambiguity about the original owner's intent. The opposing lawyer asked for a pause. He consulted Mrs. Sterling in a low voice for a few minutes. Maya watched her mother-in-law's face during that conversation without being able to hear the words. There was something different there, a tension that was no longer anger or arrogance. It was something else. The lawyer returned to the table. My client would like a private conversation with Mrs. Vance, he said. No legal representatives, just the 2 of you. Arthur looked at Maya. She nodded. The room emptied. The mediator left the door ajar. Maya and Mrs. Sterling were alone in the small room smelling of old paper, sitting across from each other with the table between them. Her mother-in-law stared at her hands for a moment. Those well-manicured hands that Maya had observed over 4 years holding cups, gripping silverware, gesturing to give weight to comments that hurt with the precision of someone well-practiced. You found the inscription, Mrs. Sterling said. It wasn't a question. I found it, Maya said. Mrs. Sterling closed her eyes for a second. He never told me he had done that, she said softly. The inscription on the stone. I knew he had kept documents there. I suspected it. But the inscription I didn't know. Maya said nothing. We went hungry in that cabin, her mother-in-law said, her voice having lost all its layers of rigidity. It sounded hollow in a way that seemed honest. I didn't want to remember that. When Samuel got on his feet, I wanted to forget everything that came before. The cabin, the poverty, the hard years. I pretended it never happened. She opened her eyes. He never managed to do the same. He kept everything. Every piece of it. Including the land, Maya said. Including the land. Her mother-in-law's voice grew softer. I asked him to sell it many times. He never sold it, and I was angry for years because of that. That place reminded me of things I preferred to forget. Silence. And when the time came for the will, Mrs. Sterling continued, I made sure the report was done in a way that was convenient. I thought that would put an end to the matter once and for all. Maya took a deep breath. Did you know there was more? Mrs. Sterling looked at her. I suspected there were documents, but I didn't imagine he had left a declaration at the county clerk's office. She paused. Samuel was always smarter than I let him seem. There was something in the way she said that sounded for the first time like respect. Late, but real. I behaved very badly toward you, Mrs. Sterling said, her voice rougher now, from the very beginning. I never gave you what you deserved. Maya stayed quiet. She had waited for words like that many times over 4 years, during tense Sunday family dinners and nights when she cried silently in the bathroom. But now that the words had come, they had arrived too late to fix everything and early enough for something to change. She didn't exactly know what to do with it. I didn't come here for you to apologize, Mrs. Sterling, she said at last. I came to resolve what needs to be resolved. Her mother-in-law nodded slowly. There was something in her face that seemed smaller than usual, not weak but human, in a way she had never shown before. I won't contest it anymore, she said. The land is yours. Samuel decided. I'm going to stop fighting my husband's decision. Maya looked at her for a moment. Thank you, she said. They were silent for another moment, with the wind moving the blinds and the smell of paper around them. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling stood up. One thing, she said, already on her feet, the inscription on the stone. Don't erase it when you restore it. Maya looked at her. I won't erase it, she said. Her mother-in-law nodded, picked up her purse and left. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. That helps us beginners a lot. Now continuing, the hearing resumed. The mediator formalized the verbal agreement. The contesting party withdrew the objection to the regularization process and acknowledged the validity of the historical documents presented. The process would proceed normally from there, without formal opposition. Otis Caldwell shook Maya's hand in the hallway. It was a good fight, he said. It's not over yet, she said. There are months of process ahead. But the hardest part is past. She nodded. Maybe that was true. Arthur Miller walked beside her to the parking lot. The regularization process will still take 6 to 8 months, he said. But without a challenge, it's just bureaucracy. You'll get there. Thank you, Arthur, for everything. He nodded and left. Maya stood by the car, key in hand, looking at the street of the neighboring town she didn't know well, but had visited many times in recent months. The sun was high. A dog crossed the sidewalk on the other side of the street. Someone knocked on a door further down. Caleb came up beside her. How did it go with her? He asked. Better than I expected, said Maya. He looked at her as if he wanted to ask more, but knew it wasn't the time. Let's go, he said, let's go. The months that followed were long in a different way from the months before. Before they had been long with anxiety and tension. Now they were long with process, waiting, paperwork, trips to the county clerk's office that sometimes moved forward and sometimes didn't. But there was a direction. And there was a difference between waiting without knowing where you're going and waiting knowing that the path exists. Maya returned to the cabin several times during those months, sometimes alone, sometimes with Caleb. She had hired an engineer to assess the structure, a man named Wyatt, who had the look of someone who had restored many old things and knew how to separate what could be saved from what couldn't. The main structure is solid, he had said on the first visit. Good stone doesn't crumble easily. The roof of part of the hallway will need reinforcement. The windows will need new frames. The stone floor is in good condition. He walked outside and looked at the walls with an expression of someone calculating. This place has history. It can be restored. I don't want to turn it into something else, Maya said. I want it to stay what it is. Wyatt nodded as if that was the answer he liked to hear. There was a day, near the end of the months of process, when Maya went alone to the cabin on a Saturday afternoon. She parked the car, opened the gate that had stopped creaking after Caleb had oiled the hinges, and walked slowly through the property. The old trees with their twisted trunks had a different quality, depending on the time of day and the season. That Saturday afternoon, with the late sun coming from the side, they cast long, uneven shadows that reached almost to the cabin. The ground was a little less dry than the first time. It had rained the previous week, and the soil had retained a light moisture that made everything a little greener, a little more alive. She went into the cabin and walked to the hallway. She stood in front of the inscription on the stone. Samuel and Eleanor, with the date that went back decades, carved by a young hand that didn't know what it was building but knew it was building something. She thought about that young Eleanor who had lived there, who had cooked without having everything she needed, who had slept through the winter cold and woken up in the morning to start over, who had kept that period with shame, as if poverty were a stain that made her smaller, without realizing that it was right there that she had been greater than she ever was afterward. And she thought about Samuel, who had carved the names into the stone knowing Eleanor wouldn't like it, but doing it anyway, because some things deserved to be remembered, even if the memory hurt. She took out her phone and photographed the inscription carefully, just as she had done the first time. Then she left the cabin and stood outside, looking at the stone facade with the trees around it and the blue Saturday afternoon sky above it all. There was a hand-drawn map, there was a rusty key, there was a declaration at the county clerk's office, there was the work of a surveyor and a lawyer, and months of legal process. There was a visit from an elderly woman with a cloth bag who had kept a package for years waiting for the right moment, and there was a young woman in a blue dress standing in front of a stone cabin with a piece of paper in her hand, looking at something everyone around had said was worthless. The regularization was completed on a Tuesday morning that started like any other Tuesday. Arthur called while she was making coffee. "It's registered," he said. "The land is in your name, all 43.2 hectares. She stood still, holding the cup for a moment. "Thank you, Arthur," she said. "You were the one who did it," he said. "I just organized the paperwork." She hung up, put the cup on the counter, looked through the kitchen window at the small yard of the house where she and Caleb lived. She didn't call anyone, didn't send a message. She stood there in silence for a moment, letting the news settle slowly. When Caleb came down for coffee, she simply said, "It's in my name." He stopped in the middle of the kitchen, looked at her. Then he crossed the space between them and hugged her, and she let him, and they stayed like that for a moment that was small in duration and large in everything else. She didn't sell the land. She had thought about it a few times over the months of the process. What to do if she won? What to do with 43 hectares of land she didn't know how to farm? What a woman of simple origins, who worked from home as an administrative assistant did, with a property that size. But when the moment came, the answer was clear, without needing much time to surface. She called Wyatt back to the property. They started with the stone cabin, reinforcing the hallway ceiling, new window frames, cleaning the cracked stone floor. The inscription on the wall was carefully preserved, no interference, no repainting, just cleaned with a soft brush and water. For the surrounding land, she talked to an agronomist who knew someone Cassie knew, and she went to meet her one afternoon in a neighboring town. She was a woman named Laurel, around 40, with the practical and excited manner of someone who loved what she did. They spent 2 hours walking through the property while Laurel assessed the soil, the slope, the seasonal stream, the native trees. "This land has potential," Laurel said. "It's not large-scale farmland, but it has excellent conditions for planting in an agroforestry system. You can produce without cutting down what's already here." "That's what I want," said Maya. She wasn't quick. There was no rush. Over those months, she had begun to understand that the things that last are the ones built calmly, and that haste belonged to those who were afraid of losing, not to those who had something real to build. Caleb started showing up at the property on weekends. At first, just to hang around, then to help. There was something about that place that did him good. A kind of silence that didn't exist in the city. A slowness to things that seemed to shrink the size of his problems. She watched him sometimes with the cabin in the background and thought that maybe Mr. Samuel knew that place would do the same for his son. Grant didn't show up anymore. Brooke sent a message a few weeks after the hearing, short and without affection, saying she hoped things would work out. Maya replied with the same brevity and didn't bring it up again. Mrs. Eleanor came to the property once. She hadn't arranged it. Maya was there one afternoon, supervising Wyatt's work on the back room window, when she heard the gate. She turned and saw her mother-in-law getting out of a taxi, alone, purse over her arm. They looked at each other for a second. "May I see?" her mother-in-law said. "You may," Maya said. They walked through the property in silence. "Mrs." Eleanor didn't say anything as she looked at the trees, the ground, the valley in the distance. She didn't say anything when she went inside the cabin. She walked through the hallway slowly, with that upright posture that had never given way, but with something in her shoulders that seemed lighter than Maya had ever seen. She stopped in front of the carving. She stood looking at it for a long time. Maya stayed a few steps back, quiet. When her mother-in-law turned, there were tears on her face. They weren't falling dramatically. They were just there, contained, like someone who had decided not to hide but also not to lose herself. "He wrote that the day we got engaged," she said. "I didn't even know he had done that." Maya stayed quiet. "We spent good years here," her mother-in-law said, "before I decided it wasn't good enough." It wasn't an apology. It was something different, an admission, a kind of truth that only comes when a person no longer has anything to lose by pretending. "Mr. Samuel knew you would find it," Mrs. Eleanor said. "He knew me better than I knew myself. He knew I would do what I did, and he kept it all anyway because he knew you would be smarter than all of us." Maya didn't answer right away. "Would you like to stay a little longer?" she asked. Her mother-in-law looked at her. There was a surprise in that look that she couldn't hide. "If I'm not in the way," she said. "You're not." They stayed in the cabin for another hour. They didn't talk about the lawsuit, didn't talk about money, didn't talk about Caleb or the hard years between them. They talked about the cabin, about the stones, about the wind that came through the windows, about the old trees that had grown around it over decades. Her mother-in-law told her some things about the early years there that Maya didn't know. And Maya listened, as she always had, with that attention that Mr. Samuel had recognized and trusted. When her mother-in-law left, the sun was beginning to drop behind the trees and the light was turning golden and long. Maya stood at the entrance of the cabin, looking at the gate through which her mother-in-law had left. There was no simple, complete forgiveness in that meeting. There was no erasing 4 years of comments, of laughter, of knowing silences. But there was something, a small opening that hadn't been there before, through which maybe some light could enter with time. Sometimes that was how things began to get resolved, not all at once, not with hugs and dramatic declarations, but little by little, with a conversation here and a shared silence there, and time doing the work that words can't do alone. Months later, when Wyatt finished the main work on the stone cabin, and she went there for the first time with the structure restored and the windows with new frames that let the light in without letting the strong wind in, Maya stood in the main room for a long time. The flagstone floor had been cleaned and regrouted where needed, but remained true to the original. The stone walls were clean but not replastered. The old texture, the imperfections, the way the stones fit together with the irregularity of someone who had worked with what they had, all of it remained. The inscription in the hallway was visible and intact. She walked over and stood before it once more. Samuel and Eleanor with the old date, carved by a hand that had bet on something when betting cost everything. Then she pulled from her pocket the folded paper she had kept with her since the day Mrs. Hazel Higgins had appeared at her door. She unfolded it carefully. She read Samuel's line for the last time. "Those who seek will find. Those who find will understand, and those who understand will know what to do." She folded the paper back up, went to the room where she had found the wooden box. The stone was back in place, the wall had been carefully restored, and stood there for a moment. Then she left the cabin, crossed the grounds under the old trees, leaned against the old wooden post near the gate, and stood looking at the stone facade against the blue afternoon sky. It was hers, not as a trophy, not as revenge, not as proof that she had beaten anyone. It was hers as the kind of thing that belongs to those who have eyes to see what others chose not to look at, and the courage to go after it even when everyone around said it wasn't worth it. She thought of Samuel, sitting in the corner at Sunday family dinners, coffee in hand, watching. She thought of what he had said that afternoon in the kitchen, in a low voice, when the family had gone back to the living room and the two of them were alone for a minute. "You have the patience of a saint, Maya." It wasn't a compliment to resignation. She understood now. It was recognition from someone who saw, who knew that attention can be the only defense for those who learn early that the world tries to erase certain people, and that the best response to those who try to erase you is not noise, but permanence. She stayed. She saw. She sought. She found. She understood. And she knew what to do. End of story. What a beautiful story, isn't it? Tell us what you thought in the comments and where you're watching from. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories coming your way.